People love to throw this passage around, and the passage that I'm referring to is Matthew chapter 7, and specifically verse 1. Jesus tells us, "Judge not, lest you be judged." But let's delve deeper into that passage, and let's really answer the question of the day, which is, can we judge others? If you want to answer that question, if you want to know more information about this topic, stay to the end of the video, and I'll see you then. You are now watching a Jay Breezy video. I hope you enjoy. In today's culture, there's a lot of talk. There's a lot of speculation around the idea of judging others. And a lot of times you'll hear phrases such as, "You can't judge me." Jesus tells us not to judge others. "Don't judge unless you be judged." "Oh, God knows my heart. Only God can judge." And when you hear phrases like this, it sounds right. It sounds good. It sounds like that's what the Bible teaches. And people love to throw this passage around, and the passage that I'm referring to is Matthew chapter 7, and specifically verse 1. Jesus tells us, "Judge not, lest you be judged." But let's delve deeper into that passage, and let's really answer the question of the day, which is, can we judge others? I think the first thing that we need to do is read Matthew chapter 7, and let's look at verses 1 through 5 in particular. So let's start off at verse 1. All right. And it says this: "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." As we look at the verses after verse 1, you know, the famous saying, "Do not judge lest you be judged." If we look at the verses after that, Jesus is telling us to be cautious in the way we judge others, not necessarily judging in and of itself. Let me break it down. We ought to judge. I'm a cut to the chase. We ought to judge. In fact, we make judgments all the time. When we see liars, when we see murderers, when we see thieves, when we see people who break the law, we don't look at those people and say, "Oh, well, they're living their life. Oh, well, they're living their life how they want to live it, and I'm going to live my life how I want to live it." No, we look at these people and we make judgments against them. We say that they're bad people, or we say that they've really messed up. Are we being bad in doing that? Are those bad judgments? Are those things that we ought not to do? No. It's the manner of which we judge. And that's the issue that Jesus is trying to get to. What's the manner? Are you judging in a fair way? So let's go ahead and break out of this illusion that we're not to judge, period, that we're not to judge others in the first place. God calls us to judge. I'm saying us as in Christians. He calls Christians to judge. Let's keep on going into the passage and let's see what else Jesus tells us to do. In verse 3, he tells this: "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there is a plank in your own eye?" And Jesus is basically saying right here, how can you address the sin of somebody else when you haven't addressed your own sin? How can you address someone else's corn addiction? How can you address someone else's anger issues? How can you address these different sin issues in their life when you struggle with the same thing? You struggle with the same addictions. And that's what leads us to verse 5. Jesus says this: "You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." So see, if we get into the context of the passage, Jesus is not telling us not to judge. He's saying to judge fairly. And he's telling us to judge in a manner that if we are to address the sin in someone else's life, we ought to address our own sin first before we address someone else's sin. And to kind of add on top of the fact that we aren't to judge, I mean, why is it that Jesus tells us in the next couple of verses to watch out for false prophets or false teachers? You don't believe me? Let's skip down to the passage. Let's go start in verse 15. Jesus says this: "Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them." By their what? By their fruits you will recognize them. How can we recognize something or somebody if we don't make a judgment call? How do we know what a false prophet is or a false teacher? How do we know what a true teacher is if we don't make a judgment call based on how they act, based on what they say, based on what they believe? You know what I'm saying? So the idea that we aren't to judge people, the idea that we're supposed to just sit on the sideline and let people behave the way they behave is idiotic. It's stupid. I'm going to end the video off by saying this. Brothers and sisters, we ought to live a life worthy of the gospel. We ought to live life as we're followers of Christ. And when one of our brothers and sisters are struggling, when one of them are dealing with issues in their life, we ought to help them up. We ought to encourage them and help them get out of their sin that they're struggling with. We ought to just lay on a sideline and say, oh, well, this person's going through that and I'm going to let them go through it because I'm not supposed to judge. No. We ought to hold each other accountable and do it in love, not in condemnation. And I understand where people are coming from when they use the phrase "don't judge," because there are people who judge in a harsh manner. They act as though that they don't have any skeletons in their closet. They act as though they don't have any sin that they're struggling with. And in reality, we all have something that we're struggling with. We all have something that God is working with us through. But in the midst of that, we ought to love and encourage each other to live a more godly life, to live a more set apart life. There is a time and a place to judge others, but be mindful of the judgments that you make. Happy Monday. I hope everyone's having a good Labor Day. I know some of y'all are off of work. I am. So I'm happy for that. And Lord's willing, I will be back with another video next week. Until then, brothers and sisters, you guys be safe. Peace and love. I'll catch you on the next one.